she was 16, Judy Garland was already America's sweetheart. Her voice could melt hearts, her smile could light up a theater. But behind the curtain, a darker scene played out, one that Hollywood refused to see. Every night, she was fed pills to sleep. Every morning, pills to wake. The studio owned her body, her voice, even her exhaustion. By the time she sang "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," the world fell in love with a little girl who was already breaking. MGM had turned her into a product, a perfect fantasy of innocence and hope. But what no one knew was that Judy was being pushed past the edge, kept alive only by chemicals and fear. Her days began at dawn, under studio lights, and ended in tears. She wasn't allowed to eat, she wasn't allowed to rest, and she certainly wasn't allowed to grow up. When she tried to rebel, they reminded her who paid the bills. When she cried, they gave her another pill. To audiences, she was Dorothy lost in a dreamland, searching for home. But in real life, there was no yellow brick road. Only control, addiction, and a lifetime of loneliness that began before she even knew what fame meant. Everyone thought Judy Garland had been born to be a star. But the truth behind that shining image is much darker. The Hollywood of the 1930 seconds was a dream factory built on discipline and illusion. It was an age when studios ruled with absolute control over contracts, over appearances, over lives. For a few $1,000s a week, they could turn anyone into a star. But for the chosen few, like Judy Garland, that dream came at a monstrous price. She was born Frances Ethel Gumm in 1922 in a small Minnesota town where her parents ran a struggling theater. From the moment she could stand, she was performing a child with a voice too big for her body, belting out songs while her mother pushed her toward the spotlight. Audiences loved her energy, her joy, that unfiltered innocence. But her mother saw more than a gift. She saw a ticket out of poverty. By the time Judy was 13, she was under contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the most powerful studio in the world. Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, liked to call her "my little hunchback," mocking her insecurity about her looks. She wasn't tall, she wasn't blonde, and she didn't fit the mold of glamour MGM demanded. So they remade her, binding her chest, painting her face, controlling what she ate, what she wore, what she was allowed to be. During the filming of The Wizard of Oz, Judy was 16. The production lasted 6 grueling months. She was forced onto a rigid diet of chicken soup and coffee to stay thin, while the studio doctors prescribed pep pills to keep her awake for 16-hour shoots, and sleeping pills to knock her out when they were done. She was still a child, surrounded by adults who treated her like an investment. When the cameras rolled, she was radiant. Her rendition of Over the Rainbow captured the ache of every lost soul in the Depression-era audience. But when the lights went off, she was just a teenager, terrified of disappointing the men who controlled her. Her mother, often called the real Wicked Witch of the West by insiders, watched from the sidelines, pushing her harder, telling her that rest was weakness and tears were unprofessional. Judy's childhood was gone before it began. The studio's control over her wasn't just professional, it was psychological. They told her she wasn't pretty enough, that her teeth were crooked, that her nose needed fixing. They weighed her daily, scolded her for eating, and reminded her she was lucky to be loved at all. And so she learned early what it meant to perform not for applause, but for survival. In the glimmering golden age of Hollywood, Judy Garland was the perfect product, a child who could make adults cry, a woman trapped in the body of a girl, a star who would spend the rest of her life trying to find her way home. Judy Garland's rise was as bright as it was brutal. After The Wizard of Oz, she became the face of MGM's wholesome family entertainment. Her voice, rich, aching, unmistakable, carried America through the Great Depression and into the war years. To audiences, she was pure magic, the eternal girl next door, the embodiment of hope in a world recovering from despair. But to MGM, she was a fragile investment that needed to be controlled at any cost. Through the 1940 seconds, Judy worked relentlessly. Film after film, song after song, smile after smile, a carousel of exhaustion that never stopped. She performed in Meet Me in Street, Louis, Easter Parade, and the Harvey Girls, her energy glowing on screen even as her body collapsed behind the curtain. Every time she faltered, the studio's solution was the same. More pills, more pressure, more perfection. At 18, she was already addicted to the drugs the studio had prescribed since she was 13, amphetamines to wake up, barbiturates to sleep. Her mind began to blur between sets. She'd forget lines, arrive late, break down in tears. Executives called her unreliable, but none of them questioned the system that had made her that way. In her 20s, she began to crave freedom, artistic, emotional, human. She married bandleader David Rose, but the marriage was short-lived. Her second husband, film director Vincente Minnelli, gave her greatest joy, her daughter, Liza Minnelli. But even that couldn't stop the spiral. Her fame brought money, but never peace. MGM continued to exploit her, even as her body and mind gave out. In 1949, the collapse came. Judy was fired from Annie Get Your Gun after another breakdown on set. The studio labeled her difficult, blacklisted her, and turned its star into a liability. She attempted suicide that same year, the first of several attempts as newspapers began to feast on her decline. For the first time, the public saw cracks in America's golden girl. But Judy was a fighter. In the early 1950 seconds, she rebuilt herself from the ashes. She turned to live performances, the Judy Garland show and her legendary concerts at Carnegie Hall, earning standing ovations that shook the room. The critics called her comeback the greatest in show business history. Her voice was rawer, deeper, alive with every scar she'd earned. She sang not like a star, but like a survivor. Yet fame never stopped demanding its price. Her marriages failed 5 in total, each one collapsing under the weight of her dependency, her exhaustion, and the chaos that fame had carved into her soul. Financial troubles haunted her. The IRS took her home. Friends watched her slip further into addiction, not from glamour but from pain. By the 1960 seconds, Judy Garland was a legend and a warning. The same system that had crowned her now used her suffering as entertainment. Late-night hosts joked about her erratic behavior. Magazines called her unpredictable. But those who truly knew her saw a woman who had been exploited since childhood, still trying to hold herself together in a world that never let her rest. Her final years were marked by flickers of brilliance and shadows of despair. Her concerts could still move audiences to tears, but behind the curtain, she was fragile, broke, and exhausted. She wanted love, peace, normalcy, but Hollywood had stolen her sense of home long ago. The little girl who once sang about a place over the rainbow had climbed every peak of fame and fallen into every valley of heartbreak. And as she neared the end of her journey, the studio machine that had built her began to whisper her name again, not with affection, but with pity. By the late 1960 seconds, Judy Garland's life had become the perfect Hollywood contradiction. A voice that could still fill an auditorium, trapped inside a body that could barely survive the night. The same child who once sang about rainbows was now drifting through London hotels, fighting insomnia, debt, and the ghosts of her past. Every performance felt like a farewell, every smile a mask covering exhaustion. Behind the scenes, the truth was unbearable. Judy was no longer protected by a studio, but she was never free of its damage. Years of forced dieting had destroyed her metabolism. The drugs prescribed to keep her working had rewired her body. She couldn't sleep without pills, couldn't wake without them either. Her body belonged to the system long after the contracts had ended. In interviews, she tried to laugh it off. "They took me out of my crib and put me on the stage," she once said. There was no time for childhood. But when the cameras stopped, her loneliness was absolute. She'd been betrayed by lovers, abandoned by studios, exploited by agents. The industry that had created her now treated her as a relic, useful only when she sang about pain. Her 5th marriage, to nightclub owner Mickey Deans, was an attempt at stability. He was younger, energetic, and saw in her both legend and vulnerability. But love couldn't fix what decades of exploitation had carved into her. She was still performing smaller venues now, often unpaid, her voice shaking, but her soul still luminous. Audiences cried because she sang like someone who knew the cost of every note. The final months were a blur of financial chaos and emotional fatigue. Friends begged her to rest. She refused. She couldn't stop moving, maybe, because slowing down meant facing the emptiness that had chased her since she was a child. On the 22nd of June 1969, in a modest London apartment, Judy Garland was found dead, a fatal overdose of barbiturates. She was 47. The coroner called it an accidental overdose, but everyone who knew her called it something else: exhaustion. The kind that comes from a lifetime of being used, misunderstood, and pushed past the breaking point. The news shattered the world. Thousands gathered in New York for her funeral. The gay community, who had long seen her as a symbol of resilience and heartbreak, mourned her as one of their own. Some even believe her death helped spark the Stonewall riots just days later, when grief turned into rebellion. But even in death, Judy Garland couldn't escape the narrative. The headline spoke of tragedy, not injustice. They called her troubled, fragile, unlucky. Few dared to say what she truly was, a victim of an industry that devoured its own children. Her daughter, Liza Minnelli, once said, "She had the most wonderful sense of humor and the saddest eyes in the world." That paradox defined Judy Garland's existence. Joy and despair, applause and silence, light and shadow. She had given everything to Hollywood, and Hollywood had taken everything back. In the end, the little girl who was told never to eat, never to rest, never to grow up, finally did the one thing she had been denied her entire life. She stopped. Looking back at Judy Garland's story, it's hard not to see her as both a miracle and a warning. She was a child of the studio era, a time when talent was molded like clay and vulnerability was treated like weakness. The same system that built her into a global icon also destroyed her from the inside out. And yet, through every collapse, she rose again, carrying a voice that refused to die. Judy's story isn't just about addiction or fame, it's about control. MGM didn't see a child, they saw a commodity. They controlled her body, her image, her food, her sleep. They told her when to smile, when to cry, and when to disappear. They even dictated her emotions through medication. It's the kind of exploitation we now recognize as abuse. But in the 1,930 seconds, it was simply studio discipline. Judy Garland was a casualty of a machine that measured success not in souls, but in box office numbers. And yet, she changed entertainment forever. Her vulnerability, the trembling voice, the way she sang like she was bleeding inside became her greatest weapon. She didn't just perform songs, she lived them. Over the Rainbow wasn't a children's lullaby anymore. It was a cry for peace from someone who never found it. Her Carnegie Hall concert in 1961 remains one of the greatest live performances ever recorded, a night when pain became art, and the audience wept, not for Dorothy, but for Judy herself. From this channel's point of view, Judy Garland represents the high cost of perfection and the extraordinary beauty of imperfection. She wasn't the flawless Hollywood product MGM wanted her to be. She was something much more human. Every tremor in her voice, every crack in her smile told the truth that the studio tried to hide. Today, when we talk about burnout, exploitation, and mental health in the entertainment industry, Judy's story feels prophetic. She exposed the dark heart of fame before anyone dared to. She was a woman decades ahead of her time, punished for her emotions, yet remembered for her courage to feel. So what do you think? Was Judy Garland a victim who never escaped her childhood trauma, or a survivor who turned that pain into timeless art? Was her death inevitable, or could a kinder world have saved her? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if she had been born today, would the system still have crushed her the same way? There's a moment at the very end of The Wizard of Oz when Dorothy closes her eyes and whispers, "There's no place like home." For Judy Garland, those words were never just a line, they were a prayer she carried for the rest of her life. She spent decades chasing that sense of belonging, that quiet corner of peace the world refused to give her. Even now, more than half a century after her death, her voice still trembles through time. It's there in every singer who lets vulnerability slip into a note, in every artist who dares to turn pain into beauty. Judy Garland taught generations that brokenness isn't weakness, it's proof that you've lived. She showed us that fragility and brilliance can exist in the same breath. The little girl who once danced down a yellow brick road never found her way home, but she left breadcrumbs for others' songs, performances, and the courage to be imperfect in a world obsessed with perfection. Each time Over the Rainbow plays, we don't just hear a melody, we hear a longing for freedom that still echoes through Hollywood's golden halls. Maybe that's why her story endures, because we recognize something of ourselves in her, the fear, the hope, the exhaustion of trying to live up to what the world expects. She was human, heartbreakingly so, and that's what makes her eternal. In the end, Judy Garland wasn't just a star. She was a survivor of an era that confused obedience with love and beauty with value. She sang through pain, she laughed through fear, and she taught us that even in the cruelest dream factory, truth can still find a voice. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now,